there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where the Trump administration is plunging American politics, the legal system, and the economy into uncharted waters by opening a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, as President Trump tries to exert control over the independent central bank, with Americans souring on his handling of the economy ahead of the midterms. The Fed chair announcing late yesterday that the Justice Department subpoenaed the agency on Friday as part of an investigation into testimony he gave to Congress last year about renovations to the Federal Reserve's headquarters, which have run hundreds of millions of dollars over budget. A defiant Powell pushing back against any allegations of wrongdoing and accusing the Trump administration of an attempted shakedown.
I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
President Trump criticizing Powell and denying he had any knowledge of the investigation in an exclusive interview with NBC News, telling my colleague Garrett Haake, "I don't know anything about the DOJ's investigation into the Federal Reserve, but he's certainly not very good at the Fed, and he's not very good at building buildings." The president, however, has made it abundantly clear that he believes Powell should be investigated, even threatening civil litigation against him just 2 weeks ago.
We're thinking about bringing a suit against Powell for incompetence, because think of it, these aren't outstanding buildings. These are small buildings. So we're thinking about bringing a gross incompetence, what's called gross incompetence lawsuit. It's gross incompetence against Powell. And it was his baby. And the guy's just incompetent. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. He's just a very incompetent man. But we're going to probably bring a lawsuit against him.
Now, at the moment, Wall Street appeared to shrug off the news of the Powell investigation. The markets closed up on the day, the S&P up more than 10%. But on Capitol Hill, the news has generated notable pushback among Republicans in both chambers. In the House, the Republican chair of the Financial Services Committee defended Powell, calling the investigation a, quote, unnecessary distraction. In the Senate, Republican Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who is not seeking re-election, threatening to vote down any of the president's Fed nominees until the issue is resolved. And in a show of force, all three living former Fed chairs, as well as several former Treasury secretaries and White House economic advisors from both sides of the aisle, calling out the Justice Department, writing in a statement, quote, "The Federal Reserve's independence and the public's perception of that independence are critical for economic performance. The reported criminal inquiry into Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell is an unprecedented attempt to use prosecutorial attacks to undermine that independence." And we are now going to talk about this more with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, along with NBC News Business and Data correspondent Brian Chung, NBC News senior justice reporter Ryan Riley, and NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin. Let's start on the North Lawn of the White House with Monica Alba. Monica, President Trump told NBC that he doesn't know anything about the Justice Department's federal subpoena. What's been the reaction at the White House to this news?
Well, this is really an extraordinary escalation, Ryan, and certainly one that the White House, from a legal perspective, is deferring specific questions to the Department of Justice, not wanting to weigh in on the specifics related to these subpoenas and to this probe in particular. But they are amplifying and repeating claims you have heard from President Trump repeatedly about the fact that they simply believe that the Fed chair is not good at his job. They have put this pretty plainly. You have seen this feud really grow between the president and the Fed chair. And even a few months ago, when they toured the site of that renovation project at the headquarters there, you saw sort of public fact-checking from Jerome Powell of President Trump's own comments in real time. So we've seen this back and forth. But the White House today is putting it this way. Here's what the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt had to say about the latest developments.
Look, the president has every right to criticize the Fed chair. He has a First Amendment right, just like all of you do. And one thing for sure, the president's made it quite clear, is Jerome Powell is bad at his job. As for whether or not Jerome Powell is a criminal, that's an answer the Department of Justice is going to have to find out, and it looks like they intend to find that out.
Now, the president has repeatedly said things like he wishes that he could fire Jerome Powell. He would need cause in order to do that, Ryan, and that is critical and important here because it relates to another case that's ongoing when you talk about Lisa Cook, who is a current governor on the Federal Reserve Board. And remember that, again, this is something the president can talk about, but then he has said for some time he was going to let Powell finish out his term, which technically is up in a matter of months.
And Monica, the Fed has been at the heart of President Trump's focus, I should say, on affordability over the past month or so. What other actions has the president taken over that time?
Yeah, and I'm told by senior White House officials that this is something you're going to hear the president talk more about. In particular, tomorrow he's headed to Michigan, where he's going to talk about some of these examples and perhaps indicate where there could be more proposals coming. We have heard him talk about several things when it comes to housing, when it comes to potential limits for credit card interest rates. Also, you have heard the president talk about things like proposing a ban on investors for buying single-family homes. He has certainly continued his pressure campaign on the Fed to lower borrowing rates, and he has also talked about price fixing when it comes to the food chain, and he has repeatedly touted certain deals with drug makers to lower the cost of prescription drug prices, even though we haven't seen the specifics on some of the deals that have been announced publicly and really where he's had events here from the White House saying this is going to happen. But consumers and the American people haven't necessarily felt the effects of that yet, but the White House is trying to lean in and say that they will soon enough. But you can certainly expect more on that affordability message, which the president sometimes dismisses, but which senior White House officials say he does need to be talking about more and more ahead of the midterms.
All right, Monica, thank you for that. Let's turn now to Brian Chung. Brian, how unprecedented or unusual is it for Jerome Powell to be this outspoken and defiant? I mean, posting a message on social media on a Sunday night, we normally don't hear from the Fed chairman on a Sunday night.
No, not at all. Usually that is a moment of crisis if they're doing that. Now, I do want to point out we are not in an economic crisis right now, but this is certainly a political crisis for the Federal Reserve, which I've been following for almost 10 years now. I have never seen an escalation to this point where you have a president who has been quarreling with his own Fed chair appointee, essentially since nominating him during his first term in 2017. We've seen plenty of jawing. We've seen the president say that he would prefer that the Federal Reserve lower interest rates more aggressively than Powell actually has followed through on, but we have not seen the president threaten a criminal complaint against him, and that is exactly where we find ourselves today. Now, again, what the Department of Justice finds is unknown. In fact, we haven't even seen the subpoena, so it's a bit unclear over exactly what the Department of Justice wants to look into here. But again, all of those inside the economics community, within those that follow the Federal Reserve very closely, have seen this as a 5-alarm fire. The threatening of trying to essentially jail the Federal Reserve chair is a threat to the central bank independence we have not seen before. But as you point out, the markets haven't really done all that much. I do want to point out that the S&P 500 rose 10 points to close the day, not 10%, but to rose 10 points today to end the day. That is essentially a zero, not very much of a notable movement there. But again, I think markets are saying we're not sure if the DOJ is actually going to turn any stone that would lead to the Fed chair going to jail, but it is nonetheless part of the erosion that we've seen over this administration of central bank independence.
And its independence has been so important, but the president does have influence over the makeup of the Fed board. How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the Federal Reserve operates independently, but the people serving on that Federal Reserve board are all appointees from the president. Now, of course, vetted and confirmed by the Senate, but the president does have the ability to announce a replacement, which kind of adds to the confusion over this story, because the president could have just simply waited until May, when Jerome Powell's term as the Fed chair ends, to simply name a new person and put his own preferred financier at the top of this central bank. So again, once we get to May, Jerome Powell's tenure will end at the Federal Reserve. The question is who will replace him. That's something and a decision that fully rests in the power of the president.
And to be clear here, the Federal Reserve does not receive or spend any taxpayer money, correct? Where does their money for their budget come from?
Yeah, and the reason why we're paying attention to this is because, again, we have not seen the subpoena from the DOJ, but the argument from the president that we've seen over the past few months has been the Federal Reserve's expenditures on this multi-billion-dollar project to renovate the building that you see on your screen ahead of you. That is the Eccles Building on Constitution Ave down in Washington, D.C. It is a historical landmark. The Federal Reserve is undergoing a multi-billion-dollar project to renovate that, which the president has said is an amount of money that they simply didn't need to spend for that project. That's the reason why you heard the president say that he's not very good, referring to Jay Powell, at building buildings. But I do want to point out, again, the money being used to build that is not coming from taxpayer money. The Federal Reserve is entirely self-funded from proceeds that they earn from their own securities, as well as fees that they get from banks. So it is not taxpayer money on the line there, Ryan.
Okay, Brian Chung, thank you for that. Let's turn now to Ryan Riley, who's in studio with me now. So, Ryan, the Justice Department says they're not going to comment on an ongoing investigation. But what potential charges could Jerome Powell face?
We haven't seen the subpoena, so we don't really know. But I also don't know if this is necessarily news that that DOJ is really hesitant to have out there, right? Because they have used the existence of these investigations for political purposes. And obviously, we've seen Donald Trump direct these prosecutions in many cases. In fact, that what we have NBC News has reported was supposed to be a private message that he sent to Pam Bondi that laid out all the enemies that he wanted Bondi to go after. So that's something that, has played a component here. Donald Trump sort of weaponizing the existence of the investigation, regardless of whether or not how those investigations end for political purposes here. And, there's the possibility that you would say the firing for cause down the line would be because of an existence of an investigation. So that's one method that he could potentially, theoretically, try to use to get rid of Powell.
And there's some dispute as to whether or not he would even have that power to fire him. That likely would have to come from the board itself. Now, we have Letitia James, we've got James Comey. We've had a number of different examples of this Department of Justice trying to go after Donald Trump's political enemies. Not many of them have gained any traction. Is there any reason to think that this would be any different?
I mean, it's a great question. I think one thing that the Justice Department has been, or the Trump administration has been looking very closely at is where else they can bring cases, because I would not suspect that a federal grand jury sitting in D.C. Would necessarily be on board with this type of move, as they've rejected a lot of cases before and are aware of the political environment, what these cases, a lot of people believe are about, which is politics and not facts in the law. So I think that could be a possibility if they try to move it somewhere else. But, it happened in EDVA as well. It happened in the Eastern District of Virginia, where grand juries have rejected these cases.
And they've had a hard time even finding prosecutors in some cases to go after these. All right, Ryan Riley, thanks for that. Let's move up now to Capitol Hill and Julie Sirkin. We've already heard some pushback, Julie, from Senate Republicans and even the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. But what is Republican leadership saying about the Justice Department investigation?
Well, Speaker Johnson, Ryan, came into the building today saying that he didn't really have a chance to look over the allegations, the specific indictment. Of course, we haven't seen a lot of this, too. I want you to take a listen to what he said later in the day, and we'll talk about what we heard from Senate leadership on the other side.
Are you concerned about the ramifications of this investigation?
We're gonna let the investigation play out. There's concern about cost overruns and whatever the allegations are. I don't know. I wasn't involved in that. It's something that you have to look into, and so we'll have to reserve judgment. I know the media loves to jump to conclusions. Everyone does every day around everything here, and I think you have to let the process play out. If Chairman Powell is innocent, then he can prove that, and it'll all come out.
Slightly different tone, Ryan. I heard from Senate Majority Leader John Thune when he walked into the Capitol scurrying past us. He simply said the allegations better be real and they better be serious. Afterwards, I followed up and I asked him, is he worried about more Republicans following Senator Thom Tillis's lead, essentially holding out their votes to confirm members of the Federal Reserve, even the chair potentially when Powell's position is up in that term in a couple of months? And he said he is. He spoke to Tillis over the weekend, and he said that this needs to be resolved quickly to maintain the independence of the Federal Reserve. So certainly more pushback than we're used to seeing on different matters throughout this first year of the second Trump administration, Ryan.
And let's dive a little deeper into that pushback. Thom Tillis right now, the only Senate Republican who's physically threatened not to confirm any Fed nominee until the matter is resolved. But we have seen some other movement or signals from Republicans that they might be willing to follow Tillis's lead. What can you tell us about that?
You mentioned French Hill. Of course, he's a member of the House, so he doesn't have the power to confirm, but that is still significant given his position. Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, she is not on the banking committee, so she doesn't have a role on that panel directly to confirm nominees who go before her, but certainly she has a vote on the floor, and she said that it is time for Congress to investigate what the Department of Justice is doing here. So this is certainly concerning for the administration. I was talking to some sources close to officials in the administration. They are concerned about this. Some of them see this to be as a mess, as a distraction. You heard some Republicans say that here as well. And it is shaping up to be one because there's so much going on here. The president needs the votes of people in the Senate for matters beyond the Federal Reserve. They need to fund the government as well, which, as you know, they're working on in the coming weeks. So this is turning out to be quite a mess for the president. And Republicans up here, as Thune suggested to me, are concerned and potentially going to follow suit in Tillis's lead.
Okay, Julie Sirkin on Capitol Hill. Julie, thank you for that. We're going to turn now to former Federal Reserve General Counsel Scott Alvarez to talk more about this issue. Mr. Alvarez, thank you for joining us. You worked at the Fed for more than 30 years. How unprecedented is it for the Justice Department to conduct a criminal investigation into the chair of the Federal Reserve?
So, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I have no knowledge of this ever being done in the history of the Federal Reserve. That someone would be, any member of the board would be investigated for criminal behavior.
And the chair, Jerome Powell, he described the Justice Department's investigation as retribution. Is that how you read the situation?
Well, I certainly think that it is an attempt to intimidate the chair. And, you know, this is a matter that's been around for quite a long time. And the Federal Reserve has been very transparent about the renovation. They put quite a lot of information on their website, testified before Congress. So there's, if you compare the testimony that Chair Powell made with the information that the Fed has made available to the public, you'll see that there is no lie, that there is no false statements made to Congress. So you have to think, well, why 7 or 8 months after the president has visited the renovation, would the Department of Justice just be beginning to look into the matter? And I think it's because nothing has happened in the last 7 months. I think it's about the next 4 months. Mm-hmm. Chair Powell's term is up in the middle of May, and he has not announced whether he would leave when his term as chair expires. He could stay on as a governor for another roughly year and a half till 2028. And I think that's what this is about. It's about showing Powell that the administration will use all the tools it has available to make his life miserable if he decides to stay on the board. And it also sends a signal to the other members of the board and the FOMC that the administration wants to have the interest rate policy the way it wants it, and it will leave no stone unturned in making sure that the other members vote the way the president wants them to vote. And if not, then the administration will go after them. And I think those are the signals that they're trying to send now, because it doesn't seem that there is really any case against Jay Powell.
Yeah, and Jay Powell is someone who is so measured with everything he says. They literally move markets. His words move markets. So he's not in any way, shape, or form a flamethrower. Were you surprised to see him be willing to do that direct-to-camera response on a Sunday night yesterday?
I was a little surprised, but then it made perfect sense. He has been personally accused and needed to make a personal response so that markets would understand where he stood on this and that he is innocent of any lying to Congress, which is the charge that they've made. And so I think it was important for him to make that statement.
You mentioned that he could make Jerome Powell's life miserable if he were to stay on as a member of the board, if he were to stay on as a governor, and perhaps maybe that's even sending a signal to the current members or future members of the board. Well, aside from an investigation like this, what are other ways that the president could make the life of an individual member of the Fed board miserable?
Well, I think the continued barbs that the president sends, calling Jay incompetent, threatening to fire him, doing the same for other members of the board. I think those things make it very difficult because I believe the board members really want to do the right thing. They want for the economy. They focus on the data. They try to keep credibility with the markets. And anything that suggests that they might be responding to political pressure, either holding a line that they wouldn't ordinarily hold or succumbing to the pressure and doing what the president asks, either one of those creates uncertainty about their position and their credibility. And I think that's a real problem for all the members of the board.
And President Trump's also threatening to sue Powell for incompetence. This is even separate from this threat of a federal investigation. Would a lawsuit like that even hold up in court?
So I assume that what he's really talking about is firing the chair for cause, and the cause being incompetence. I don't see how there could be a personal lawsuit outside of that for anything against the chair. So I don't really know what exactly the president was talking about.
So you're suggesting that he's throwing this out there as a reason to point to to fire him for cause, as opposed to actually going through with filing a lawsuit?
Correct. Yeah.
And so I understand it. Does the president of the United States even have that ability to fire the chair of the Federal Board of Reserve for cause, or is that the responsibility of the other board members? Like, where does that checks and balance play?
Certainly. So that is an issue the Supreme Court is deciding now. The Federal Reserve Act says that the president can remove governor for cause. This has come up in a bunch of different statutes. The Supreme Court is looking at that across a variety of independent agencies. And so far, the Supreme Court has suggested, has actually held, that for cause protection is probably not going to be available for any agency except perhaps the Federal Reserve. Okay. Now, the Supreme Court sent signals about where it's going to come out on the Federal Reserve, but it hasn't actually made that decision. That's part of what's going on in the Lisa Cook case. So I'm hoping the Supreme Court is watching what's going on now, because the president is, I think, trying intimidation and using all the tools that he thinks he has. And so the Supreme Court is going to have to be clear. Does the Federal Reserve have protection, for cause protection from removal? What does it mean to be for cause? Is there any due process that members that are going to be fired have? Yeah. Those are all things that are caught up in this current investigation and intimidation. Okay. And also,
we're going to have to leave it there. Okay, great. We're going to have to leave it there, Mr. Alvarez. Thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
President Trump weighs an attack on Iran, saying it looks like the regime has crossed his red line, with human rights activists now saying hundreds more protesters have been killed amid an intensifying crackdown by the Iranian government. Plus, state and local officials are set to speak in Minnesota minutes from now, responding to the Trump administration's ramping up of federal operations in the Twin Cities after last week's deadly ICE shooting of Renee Nicole Good. We'll bring you that press conference live when it happens. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The death toll in Iran is skyrocketing as Tehran cracks down on what's become the largest anti-government protests in the country's history. Human rights groups say nearly 600 people have been killed, including dozens of Iran's security forces. They also estimate that more than 10,000 people have been arrested in connection with these protests, which have now been going on for more than 2 weeks. Iran's foreign minister claimed the situation was, quote, under total control, and baselessly blamed the United States and Israel for the violence. We do want to warn our viewers that some of these images that you're about to see are disturbing. This was the scene outside a medical facility in Tehran province. Body bags lining the streets as families came to identify their deceased. You can hear them screaming out and sobbing as they mourn their loved ones. Anti-government activists tell NBC News that security forces are using live ammunition to stop the uprising. President Trump, who previously threatened U.S. action if Iran kills any protesters, telling reporters yesterday he's considering strong options when it comes to responding to Iran.
Looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it, and we're looking at some very strong options. Iran called to negotiate. Yesterday, the leaders of Iran called. They want to negotiate. I think they're tired of being beat up by the United States. Iran wants to negotiate, yes. We may meet with them. I mean, a meeting is being set up. But we may have to act because of what's happening before the meeting.
President Trump also telling NBC News in an exclusive phone interview that the U.S. response could happen in the coming days. Joining me now is NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube and Hadi Ghaemi, who is the executive director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. So, Courtney, let's start with you. What are some of the options the president could be considering to respond to Iran?
So they really fall in two buckets, right? There's the one that is getting the most attention. That's the idea of kinetic strikes, military strikes. They could go after things that would potentially hurt the regime. So what could that be? Any kind of a military facility, especially the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They could go after leadership, something like that. That's the one bucket. The next one, which, seems to be gaining some momentum, but again, we have no idea what the president's going to decide to do here, is what the military might call the gray zone option. So it's not necessarily an overt strike. It's not necessarily overt action even, but it's things like providing things to the protesters that could support them with their protests. So anything from communication, money, frankly, if they wanted to, anything that would help them with their efforts to protest, but would be falling short of a direct military action.
And speaking of a direct military action, Iran's parliamentary speaker warned that if the U.S. did do something like that, military bases, U.S. ships could become targets. How seriously would the administration be taking those threats?
They have to take it seriously because Iran has the capability. We don't know if they actually have the will or the desire to carry out a strike, but they have ballistic missiles that can reach U.S. military installations and people all over the region and into Europe. So, and remember, after the U.S. took the strikes in June, Iran retaliated by lobbing off missiles, firing missiles at Al-Udeid, the biggest U.S. airbase in the region. So it may not be a false threat. But the U.S. also has to factor in the second and third order effects of that. That is, if the U.S. were to take some sort of a strike, if Iran were to retaliate, if the U.S. were to strike again, presumably it would be even larger. Back in June, and even more than that, back in October of 2024, the U.S. and the Israelis decimated Iran's air defense systems throughout Iran. So if they wanted to take more strikes, the U.S. that is, Iran can't do a whole lot to defend against them. And if they were to carry out strikes against the Americans, I could see the Trump administration taking even bigger strikes and more widespread.
Okay. Thank you, Courtney. We appreciate that. Let's bring in Hadi now. Your organization spoke to a doctor in Iran who treated a large number of protesters that were injured in the demonstrations over the weekend. And what did they tell you, and what are you hearing about what's happening on the ground?
Yes, this is a doctor who was active in hospitals and medical clinics in Tehran from Tuesday till Friday of last week, and then Friday and Saturday he was in the city of Isfahan. So he really was in the thick of things. And the highlight of what he told us is basically that everything changed on Thursday night around 10 p.m. when complete internet and communication networks went down. And the nature of injured people being brought to the hospitals changed. Their numbers skyrocketed. And he said we went from a situation where we had pellet shotguns, rubber bullet guns, single shots from small arms, up to Thursday night. It suddenly changed to a wartime situation. We started getting people in large numbers with live ammunition shot at them, machine guns, automatic weapons. He said all indication was that basically the police was moved to the background. Revolutionary Guards came in with wartime weaponry and committed a massacre. That is becoming confirmed more and more now. So he also mentioned that the hospitals have to turn in information about the injured to Revolutionary Guards and intelligence services. So a lot of people are afraid of going to hospitals. And he basically said the city center looks like a war zone. The number of protesters, I believe, in Tehran on Thursday night were historically huge, probably the largest since the 1978 revolution.
Wow, it sounds like a nightmare. President Trump said that he's considering strong options to respond to Iran's crackdown. I mean, what should that response look like? How do you pressure the Iranian regime without doing more harm to these demonstrators?
It's a good question. Whatever is done should be decisive enough to help the protester, not harm them. In my opinion, right now, there is no need for kinetic military action because that has to be basically make the regime unable to go back in the streets and shoot at people. It has to be very large and decisive. However, I, for example, would like to see a complete diplomatic isolation of the regime and more economic pressure in terms of the way it is paying the people on the street to carry out its orders. That money comes from a very cheap oil it's selling to China. That can be brought to a halt. And then most importantly, as your analyst also noted, means of communication, internet. There are many ways to help overcome this internet shutdown. So I hope these actions will be taken immediately. And if there is now suddenly talk of momentum for negotiations, those negotiations cannot be limited to the nuclear issue anymore. Safety of the protester and their freedoms to assemble and have free speech must become a demand of on the Iranian government if it wants to come out of the current situation and the threats that are being made.
Okay, Hadi Gaemi, thank you so much for your perspective. We appreciate it. Well, thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we are live in Minneapolis as the Trump administration defies local officials and surges hundreds more federal agents to the Twin Cities after last week's fatal ICE shooting. Keep it here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We are going to take you live now to Minnesota, where the leaders there, including the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, and the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, are holding a press conference about the future of the Trump administration's law enforcement operations in their state following the killing of Renee Nicole Good by an ICE officer. Let's take you to Minneapolis and listen in to this press conference.
Just has to stop. We allege that the obvious targeting of Minnesota for our diversity, for our democracy, and our differences of opinion with the federal government is a violation of the Constitution and of federal law. We allege that the surge, reckless impact on our schools, on our local law enforcement is a violation of the 10th Amendment and the sovereign laws and powers of the Constitution grants to states. We allege that DHS's use of excessive and lethal force, their warrantless, racist arrests, their targeting of our courts, our churches, houses of worship, and schools are a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act on arbitrary and capricious federal actions. And we ask that the courts will end the surge of thousands of DHS agents into Minnesota. We ask the courts to end the DHS unlawful behavior in our state. The intimidation, the threats, the violence. We ask the courts to end the tactics on our places of worship, our schools, our courts, our marketplaces, our hospitals, and even funeral homes. The deployment of thousands of armed, mass DHS agents to Minnesota has done our state serious harm. This is, in essence, a federal invasion of the Twin Cities and Minnesota, and it must stop. DHS agents have sown chaos and terror across the metropolitan area and in cities across the state of Minnesota. Schools have gone onto lockdown. Entire districts have had to cancel school for tens of thousands of students to ensure safety and offer online education because of the students' and the parents' fear of coming into the school. Local businesses are struggling. Revenues are down. And some retail stores, daycares, and restaurants have actually closed because people are afraid to go out and to do their shopping, whether they're immigrants or whether they are citizens of many generations. This surge has made us less safe. Thousands of poorly trained, aggressive, and armed agents of the state, of the federal government, have rolled into our communities, overwhelmed our local police departments, and law enforcement agencies should be focused on our public safety, but instead, many are dealing with the aftermath of DHS agents' chaos and violence. I want to thank our law enforcement officers for doing a tremendous job under very difficult circumstances. Not the people, but the federal government. Minneapolis police have had to respond to more than 20 ICE-related incidents, like witnesses seeking people being pulled into unmarked vehicles by men en masse, or ICE abandoning vehicles on the street with people detained inside. This is an unlawful commandeering of police resources. In just 2 days, responding to the chaos ICE has cost the city $2 billion in law enforcement and overtime expenses. 2 days. And I wish I could stop there, but I can't, because these poorly trained, aggressive, and armed agents of the federal state have terrorized Minnesota with widespread unlawful conduct. They're making unconstitutional arrests and using excessive force. DHS agents have barged into restaurants asking to access secure areas, and when asked to present a warrant, which is required by law, they respond, "We don't need one." DHS agents have arrested peaceful bystanders. They have fired chemical irritants at people obeying lawful orders while exercising their First Amendment rights. They have even done so at some of our most sensitive places, like Roosevelt High School here in Minneapolis. They have detained law-abiding citizens, leaving them handcuffed for hours just because of the color of their skin, or what they're wearing, or they speak English with an accent. And on January 7th, 2026, a DHS agent shot and killed Renee Nicole Good, leaving her children without a mother and her 6-year-old son without either parent. This has to stop. So let's be clear, it never should have started. These agents have no good reason to be here. Minnesota's non-citizen immigrant population is just 1.5%, which is half the national average. Our state's percentage is lower than Utah, Texas, and Florida's, but none of those states have thousands of federal agents swarming their streets or harming their people. The administration says that they're focused on finding criminals. Worst of the worst, they say. But many of the people the DHS is arresting in Minnesota have no criminal history. That fits a pattern. In 2025, 93% of the people arrested by ICE had no violent criminal history, 65% had no criminal convictions at all, and randomly stopping people in the street because their skin color isn't the one that they expect or want isn't doing a thing to help public safety. I've heard the administration talk about fraud. No, not the 43 fraud convictions the president has, or the $43 million fraudsters the president has pardoned, but instead saying that ICE is here to look for fraud somehow. You know, we work with federal government all the time, and if the federal government wants to help us with forensic accountants, we're open to that conversation. But these ICE agents who are engaged in the behavior that they're engaged in are not helping public safety at all. Immigration enforcement agents aren't trained to investigate fraud, and randomly stopping people in the street because you don't like their accent isn't going to stop fraud. So enforcing federal immigration law and fighting fraud are just pretexts for this surge. The real reason, it's no secret. Donald Trump and his administration have been targeting people, cities, and states that don't agree with them politically. He singled out Minnesota countless times. He's called us corrupt and crooked. He's attacked our funding to the tune of billions of dollars, which we are challenging. And we fought back, of course. He's attacked programs that Minnesotans rely on and tried to shut them down and pay taxes for. And he's attacked Minnesotans with despicable, racist, xenophobic language. The truth is, Donald Trump doesn't seem to like our state very much. But what's that about? He doesn't like our best in the nation, safe and secure elections. And sometimes he doesn't like who we choose in them. Just last week, Trump claimed that he won Minnesota 3 times, when in fact, he's never won Minnesota. He doesn't like how we take care of each other or how we make sure our kids have enough to eat. He doesn't like the strength that immigrant communities bring to our state. And he doesn't seem to like that we protect our neighbors no matter where they were born. In short, The Trump administration's decision to target Minnesota and Twin Cities is motivated by a desire to retaliate against Trump's perceived political opponents, who are the people of the state of Minnesota and the Twin Cities, rather than any good faith concerns about immigration enforcement, public safety, or law enforcement. In conclusion, I didn't have the pleasure and the benefit of knowing Renee Nicole Good, but her friends and family knew her as someone who was kind, someone who loved her family deeply, and someone willing to stand up for her neighbors. That sounds like the Minnesota that I know. The administration wants to paint false political narratives about us, but we know who we are and we know our rights. The Constitution gives Minnesota the sovereign authority to protect health and well-being of every single person who lives on our borders. The Constitution gives us the right to vote for who we want, pray however we want, and be whoever we want, without fear of being racially profiled, assaulted, or killed in our own communities. We're going to defend those rights because, as much as they like to believe it, DHS is not above the law, and the people of Minnesota are certainly not beneath it. Let me now bring forward my mayor, the mayor where I go home at night and is doing a wonderful job protecting our city, Mayor Jacob Fry.
Thank you, Attorney General Ellison, for your leadership and your incredible team's work around this issue. Thank you to Mayor Herr of St. Paul for your partnership. These are not normal times, and so the response that we are asking for from the judicial system and from the courts requires that we file suit at this particular moment. What we are seeing right now is not normal immigration enforcement. We are not asking ICE not to do ICE things. We are asking this federal government to stop the unconstitutional conduct that is invading our streets each and every day. You've seen the videos. At times there are as many as 50 agents arresting one person. The scale is wildly disproportionate and has nothing to do with keeping people safe. In Minneapolis, we've done work extensively with the federal government under multiple administrations to keep people in our city safe. We have worked with the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, the Attorney General's office, as well as the U.S. Attorney's office, to successfully drive down crime in our city. We've seen the results of that work, but let's be clear. The stated reason of this federal government for bringing in this full invasion of ICE and border control is not safety. If it were safety, there would be other mechanisms to achieve safety. By the way, crime is down in virtually every category, in virtually every neighborhood of this city. If this were about fraud, then you'd see an invasion perhaps of accountants. But that's not what you see. What you see is people being indiscriminately taken off our streets. Discrimination only takes place to the extent that a determination has made that somebody is Somali or is Latino, or at least they look that way, and then there is virtually no discrimination thereafter. Here's the thing. You can't indiscriminately take people off our streets, American citizens off our streets. You cannot drag pregnant women through the snow. You're not allowed to take teenagers out of their car and detain them when they are, in fact, American citizens. That is against the law in every state. That is against our United States Constitution. And we're feeling the impact here in Minneapolis. Schools have closed. People are afraid to go to work, shop, or seek medical care. 911 calls are up. Police resources are indeed stretched thin. We have approximately 600 officers in the city of Minneapolis. Mayor Herr has approximately 600 officers in the city of St. Paul. The number of ICE agents and border control are now in the thousands. They are in the thousands. If the goal was immigration enforcement, if the goal were simply to look for people that are undocumented, Minneapolis and St. Paul would not be the place where you would go. There are countless more people that are undocumented in Florida and Texas and Utah. Why are they in these much smaller cities in the middle of the Midwest? The answer is very clear. It is politics. Florida and Texas and Utah are Republican states. The reason that Minnesota and Minneapolis are being targeted is because you've got a Democratic governor, a Democratic attorney general, and you got Democratic mayors. We are doing everything possible to keep our cities safe through this unprecedented time, and at the same time, we have police officers that are tired. We've seen damage substantially because we're now having to pay a ton of overtime. Millions of dollars of emergency overtime for law enforcement. Emergency operations have been activated across our city and state agencies, pulling focus on daily core services that we, by the way, are tasked with providing. Local police officers are being diverted from the very work that we need to be doing, and small businesses are losing significant revenue, with some worried that they may not survive this at all. People are scared to take their kids into school or daycare, to go into work. They're going to have difficulty paying rent. There is no doubt in my mind the kind of action that the federal government is taking is not just mean-spirited. It's unconstitutional, and every one of us need to be standing up. Let me give you another example. Just last week, a group of our city's public works employees were stopped by ICE agents. 3 of the 4 employees were not white. The ICE agents asked to see the IDs of the 3 non-white employees and didn't even bother to ask the white employee for the identification. Minneapolis is being targeted because we stand up for our neighbors and we welcome immigrants, because we believe in the law. And as I said, frankly, because we are in a blue city in a blue state. Donald Trump should know, as long as federal agents are in our city acting unconstitutionally against our neighbors, we will continue to push back with everything we got. And let me just take a moment to say how grateful I am to the residents of our city and of our state. We are not victims in the city of Minneapolis. We've got heroes that are standing up for each other, that are standing by the neighbors that they love. And one thing that I can tell you for certain is that we aren't backing down. We don't retreat in Minneapolis. We don't back down in Minnesota. We stand up against bullies, and right now, what we are asking for is an intervention from the court to push back on this unconstitutional conduct, pure and simple. I'll now turn it off to Mayor Herr.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm proud to stand with Mayor Frey and Attorney General Ellison to fight for our residents. This federal occupation of our cities needs to end immediately. Federal law enforcement is racially profiling our residents, creating mass chaos, and undermining the relationship between local government and our communities. We will not stand idly by and watch this happen. With this collective action, we are taking a firm stance to tell federal law enforcement that this cannot happen in our country. It cannot happen in our state, and it cannot happen in St. Paul. Federal law enforcement is going far beyond what they can and should be doing to enforce immigration laws. They are endangering our community's safety, straining our resources, and sowing distrust. While we know we can't control federal agents, we will pull every lever we have to fight back in every way that we can. They've come into St. Paul and needlessly invaded our neighborhoods and homes. They're targeting us based on what we look and sound like. Our residents are scared, and as local officials, we have a responsibility to act. I want to thank Attorney General Ellison and Mayor Frey for taking a united stance for the people of Minnesota. And to our immigrant and refugee communities, let me be clear. You are a vital part of our city. You are loved, and you are wanted, and you are important to the fabric of our state. As a refugee who came to this country, this is the state that welcomed my grandparents here in the late 70s, allowed our family to break the cycle of poverty in one generation, educated us, allowed us to build wealth, and within one generation have a new family members that are educated and a part of this economy and this workforce. That we need to continue to make sure that our state stays that, and that can't happen if ICE continues to run amok of our city and our state. And so we cannot let this federal administration divide us. We need to come together now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.
All right, you've been listening to a press conference with leaders in Minnesota, the Attorney General, the mayors of both St. Paul and Minneapolis, who are discussing a lawsuit that they're filing against the federal government to try and limit the role of ICE agents in their state and in their individual cities. Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Shaq Brewster, who is outside that press conference at Minneapolis City Hall, and also NBC News legal analyst Danny Savallo. Shaq, let's start with you. As we hear from these local officials, what should we take from this announcement that they are making? What exactly do they hope to accomplish here?
Yeah, I think this is the local government pushing back on what we've been seeing from the federal government, not just in the shooting of Renee Good, but also in this Operation Metro Surge, this increased immigration enforcement that folks here in the Twin City area have been dealing with for over a month at this point. You heard the Twin City mayors as well as the Attorney General suggest that this is an unlawful, unconstitutional operation. They're essentially saying that they are under occupation. They're being occupied by the federal government. And as we were watching that press conference, I went through and started to read through the lawsuit that was filed in federal court. And just to pull out a couple of the points that they were making, one, they're saying that the surge is having an impact on local resources. It's having an impact on the police department. The mayor said that they have been spending millions toward police overtime. Well, in the lawsuit, they quantify that and say that $52 million at least has been spent on police overtime, that there's it has required thousands of hours, 3,000 hours of overtime in just the 2 hours after Miss Good was killed. And they're saying that the federal government is sowing a lot of the unrest that you are seeing. And when we talk about the immigration enforcement, the DHS, the federal government, they're saying they're doing what they are supposed to be doing, that this is them enforcing immigration laws, and they're saying that they're not going to stop. We saw that as recently as earlier today, where we had our colleague Maggie Vespa was there, and she saw a flood of Border Patrol, some sort of immigration action taking place. They were reaching out to DHS to see exactly what was going on, but you saw members of the community come around, surround these officers. Tear gas was used, pepper balls, flashbangs. You're seeing these clashes over and over again. You're seeing these viral videos over and over again, and you have local leaders now saying, essentially, enough is enough. They're asking a court to step in on what they see as, again, unlawful and unconstitutional, Ryan.
All right, so let's get the legal perspective on this with Danny Savallo. Danny, I want to read for you what the Attorney General said. He said, we're asking the courts to end the DHS unlawful behavior in our state, the intimidation, the threats, the violence. We ask the courts to end the tactics in our places of worship, our schools, our courts, our marketplaces, our hospitals, and even our funeral homes. Could a court do that? Could a court take this lawsuit and then tell ICE that they can no longer operate in a city like Minneapolis or a state like Minnesota?
A federal court could, and they filed in federal court, so it is theoretically possible, although the lead count is a violation of the 10th Amendment, essentially saying that the federal government is violating the powers that are reserved to the states. And they're correct that the police power, the power to legislate in the area of health, safety, morals, and welfare, are traditionally left to the states. What I expect the federal government will respond with is saying that, yes, simply because there is a consequence or there's a collateral effect of our federal law enforcement or our federal actions doesn't necessarily create a 10th Amendment violation. In other words, the argument that the cities are making is that essentially the federal government's interfering with their power, the state power, to police their own people.
Shaq, do we expect that the situation in Minneapolis and in that general vicinity is just only going to get worse? You have already described what the tension is like there. If a surge in officers comes, could that make the situation even worse?
I think that is potentially the case, and I think that's the fear that you're hearing among local leaders here. You know, if I can add one other thing to the press conference and the action that we're seeing, this lawsuit, I think the reason why you're seeing this from local leaders, it kind of made me think back to what we saw in Chicago earlier in the fall, where that was the one tool that local leaders had in stopping any action against, or that the federal government was taking. In Chicago, you had situations where federal judges were the ones who were able to improve conditions in some of the detention facilities that put restrictions on Border Patrol from using things like flashbangs and also those crowd control munitions. So I think you have Minnesota leaders doing what they can legally to hopefully stop, in their words, the unlawful action from the federal government.
Okay. Shaq and Danny, thank you for that. The breaking news that the Twin Cities in Minnesota suing the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol over the use of federal forces. We appreciate you being here, and we appreciate you watching. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press, but there's more news ahead on NBC News Now.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.